but for myself, yes, I would say Szczecin is my home, for sure. And what's striking for me was that there was no real lunch break.
And also, don't call me a stalker, but I've done my research.
I don't want to make it sound too French revolutionary.
So it's great to hear that after having those experiences in roundabouts in Szczecin, when I come to Paris, I'm going to be totally fine. Hi, hello. I'm so happy to greet you here at our new program Into Us, where we, as participants of the RISE team, meet here in Univision with students from different countries, plunging into their experiences, sharing emotions and their stories. But today's episode is quite special because I'm here not with a student, but with a professor. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ilona Tokareva and my guest is Professor Pierre Weber.
Nice to meet you.
Ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, doctor with a habilitation degree, a historian specializing in modern history, an associate professor of the Szczecin University at Institute of History, honorary consulate of France in Szczecin. He's a French citizen who was born in Austria. He studied history, German and Slavonic philologies in Angers and Paris. He defended his doctoral dissertation in Sorbonne University, and in his research, he is primarily interested in German-Polish relations in the international context, the normalization and reconciliation processes in Europe since 1945, and the role of emotions, for example, fear in international relations. That was quite a lot, and sincerely, I'm quite impressed. So, how are you feeling today? How is it going?
Well, nice. Thank you for inviting me and considering this, this bio as interesting for your program, even if, as I assume, it's more about students, but before becoming a whatsoever professor, you start being a student. So that's also part of my curriculum.
Yeah, perfect. So I would like to propose you to start from the very, very start of your biography. So as I see, a lot of your works, even your thesis, doctoral thesis, was concentrating on Poland, so Polish-German relations. And I'm so interested in how did it happen, basically? You, as a French person, were interested in Poland.
Yeah, there was no family background, I would say, quite at the beginning. It was more because I was interested in Germany, German studies, in Germany, in international relations, especially in the 20th century and since 45, after Second World War. And as you mentioned it, the normalization processes with former enemies or countries that had been attacked by the Third Reich and the Nazis. So there had been already quite much written and researched about French-German relations, which is still an interesting topic. But as a French, I was more curious about topics that so far, and to some extent still now, but not that bad as usual, as it used to be, were not that well known in France. So I got interested, we could say, in the other side of the German moon, so looking toward the east and not toward the west. But Poland was part of a sort of imaginary I had already as a child, because back in the early 80s, I was very young, but my grandmother, my French grandmother, had some Polish friend in our little town in France, and after there was the martial law in Poland, there was a very strong engagement of not only the French, but especially the French civil society in order to bring some help, material help and so on to Poland. And my grandmother was very much engaged. So there was always this Polish friend of hers and her family that were around. And so Poland was something I could refer to, even if it was not a personal family background.
So perfect. And then, as far as I know, you got an opportunity to become a professor in Polish University, and you came here.
Yeah, well, not at once. In fact, I was just after my PhD, as you mentioned it, in Paris, and thanks to my PhD advisor, I got the information that the University of Szczecin was looking for a native speaker, French native speaker, for the chair of Romance, Culture, Philology. And so I thought, like, oh, why not? It was for 1 year or two to start with something. And well, I applied. I was accepted, and I had a status as a visiting professor. But I was just PhD. It's not the same as a real professorship. It's some hybrid status to invite foreigners to work at a new university in your country. And well, several factors made that this happened to be more than 2 years. And in fact, I stayed about 10 years at the Faculty of Philology. Then the structure of the university changed a bit. But then after the habilitation you mentioned, I switched to the institute, the department, which was in accordance with my research as a historian. So where I'm working, I have been working for the past 7 years, the Institute of History of our university.
Wonderful. And was it the love from the first sight with Poland and Szczecin, or there were some things you couldn't get acquainted with and get used to?
Well, I had been to Poland several times before settling. Well, I didn't know I would settle in Szczecin, but before arriving and starting working in Szczecin. So, in fact, I started in 2007, but since 2003, I had already been many times to Poland for short trips or longer trips during my PhD, for research, for language courses too, summer courses for foreigners and so on. So Poland was not something new, was not a totally new reality I discovered just arriving for work. And I had been curious about Poland much earlier, so even if there were things that might have been a bit surprising in the habits, it was nothing that could not be overcome. There was one point when I started working about the schedule. You know, as you know, as a student, schedule is from 8:15 here, and mainly, well, it can be shorter to 3 p.m. or sometimes longer. And what's striking for me was that there was no real lunch break. You know, even if you have a look at the French embassy in Poland, they have a lunch break from 12 to 2. Yeah, and you can call whoever you want, nobody answers. And here you had only 15 minutes and so on. At the beginning it was a bit difficult to wait for 3 to have lunch, but you can adapt to everything.
Okay, perfect. And you live in Poland for such a long time. Can you call it a home or not yet?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, I would never dare to call myself a Pole. I don't think I would apply for Polish citizenship. However, it's easy. I could do it without any problem, working here, speaking a language. But I think citizenship is not just a paper, like, you know, sometimes some billionaires just wanting to have citizenship to escape some tax and so on. No, it's about identity, it's about what you feel, what's important for you. Poland is important for me. My wife is Polish. We have 2 kids who feel themselves, I think, in the first place as Poles, even if they have a very strong link to France. But for myself, yes, I would say Szczecin is my home, for sure.
Okay, wonderful. And also, don't call me a stalker, but I've done my research, and you have studied in University of Catholic Studies in Angers, master's degree in Angers, in Paris, Sorbonne Nouvelle, doctoral studies in Paris, then Germany, Darmstadt, Berlin, Warsaw, also Wrocław and Lublin. And I'm quite sure that when you were studying and also having your theses in different countries, you could see some differences in the education system, and maybe you would love to implement something from those countries to University of Szczecin.
You know,
except for the lunch break, because we all know that we would like to have that.
Yeah, well, for sure, there are some difference in the way maybe universities organized. Maybe there's a stronger consideration for certain traditions, for a certain etiquette at the universities in Poland, or I would say it's not so specifically Polish, it's more Central European. You see it also to some extent, even if it's weakening in Germany, in Austria, in many countries, Czech Republic, with titles and so on. Well, I know it's a mark of respect, and I do respect it too when I speak to colleagues, and I attach importance to be sure I mention the right title, because it's what is being done. Well, we're used to do it in Poland, so we have to respect it in the country you are. But this is a certain difference. In France, for example, whatever you are, if you are a PhD student, an assistant professor, full professor, whatever, at university everybody calls himself Monsieur, Madame. Nobody draws attention to the title. You know who is in a higher position, but the one in a higher position does not expect you to mention it. Everybody knows. It doesn't mean that it has no significance, that you do not mention it. Sometimes it can be a bit difficult, you know, for foreigners in Poland to get used to that and to make sure not to have a sort of faux pas, you know, call a doctor a professor, professor doctor, and so on. This is something that maybe would make it easier, but it's not specific to Szczecin. It's maybe to Poland and to the larger macro region, I would say.
So we're talking about less formalization and just treating each other like Monsieur and Madame. Yes, exactly.
Maybe. I don't want to make it sound too French revolutionary, but as you asked me for differences, it's one I could mention.
Okay, perfect. And the last one. Often we hear that Szczecin is the second Paris due to its structure and architecture. Do you see any similarities, or is it just a myth?
Well, it's not a myth, but you could call it a urban legend. Yeah, there is something about it, but then it has been a bit exaggerated, maybe. But for sure, the link is, as you might know, is that the moment in time when the urban structure of Szczecin was modernized and with these squares and roundabouts and alleys, is pretty much the time when certain schemes like that were being practiced also in Paris, and there was a certain architectural school about this. So it's nothing wrong about that, saying that you know, as an element of city branding, let's say, to mention it as a sort of Eastern Paris. There are other cities, you know, Bucharest in Romania also is called sometimes the Paris of the East. So, well, there are some aspects that you can relate to. But then, as usual, you know, in popular discourse, it becomes a bit mixed up or exaggerated. But there's nothing bad about that.
So it's great to hear that after having those experiences in roundabouts in Szczecin, when I come to Paris, I'm going to be totally fine.
Yeah, I guess so. Maybe except for the main one around Arc de Triomphe in Paris, which is quite a challenge.
Okay, so thank you so much for this short but very fruitful interview. I hope that it was really interesting for our audience as well. And thank you so much for being with us. And we do not say goodbye, we say see you next time. There's so much interesting yet to come.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much.